The stench of decay filled Jamestown on the morning of September 23rd, 1609. Captain John Smith stood at the edge of the fort, watching smoke rise from cooking fires that had nothing to cook. His left thigh throbbed beneath crude bandages, the flesh still raw and blistered from the gunpowder explosion that had torn through him days earlier. They said it was an accident, a spark on the boat, a flash of light, and suddenly his leg was burning. Smith had thrown himself into the James River to douse the flames, screaming as the cold water met ruined flesh. Some men rushed to help him, others simply watched, their faces unreadable in the chaos. Now, as he limped through the settlement, Smith saw the truth in their eyes. Resentment, calculation, relief that he was weakened. The colony had changed since the third supply arrived in August, bringing hundreds of new mouths to feed and fresh ambitions to challenge his authority. Gabriel Archer stood among a group of gentlemen near the storehouse, his posture confident, his voice carrying across the morning air. Archer had arrived with the supply ships, bringing with him a charter that spoke of democracy and shared governance. He gathered followers like a preacher, speaking of ending Smith's harsh rule, of giving every man a voice in the colony's future. Smith knew what Archer really wanted: power, the captaincy. Control of a dying settlement that would collapse without the discipline Smith had fought to maintain. The fort itself seemed to be rotting. Wooden structures sagged under their own weight. The well water tasted foul, thick with sediment and something worse. Nearly 500 colonists now crowded into a space meant for 100, and the supplies brought by the third supply were already running dangerously low. Smith had tried to prepare them. Throughout the summer, he had enforced his iron rule: "He that will not work shall not eat." It was brutal, but necessary. Men who refused to plant corn, to fish, to hunt, to maintain the fort. They received nothing. Some called him a tyrant. Smith called it survival. But now, injured and weakened, his authority was crumbling like the palisade walls around them. The gentlemen who had never accepted his leadership saw opportunity in his wound. They gathered in corners, whispering, planning, waiting for the moment to strike. John Ratcliffe joined Archer's group, his face twisted with barely concealed satisfaction. Ratcliffe had been president before Smith, deposed for incompetence and cruelty. Now he sensed his chance to reclaim power, to punish the man who had humiliated him. Smith watched them and understood. His time in Jamestown was ending, not because of his wound, though that was excuse enough, but because the colony no longer wanted the harsh discipline that had kept them alive. They wanted comfort. They wanted ease. They wanted someone to tell them that survival did not require sacrifice. They would learn. When winter came and the food ran out, when the Powhatan cut off all trade, when desperation turned men into something less than human, then they would remember why Smith's rules had mattered. But by then, it would be far too late. The September sun beat down on the fort, and John Smith knew with terrible certainty that he was looking at a settlement already dead. They just did not know it yet. George Percy stood in the shadow of the storehouse, watching the political maneuvering with growing unease. Percy had arrived with the first settlers in 1607, surviving through luck more than skill. He was not a strong leader, but he understood Jamestown's fragile balance better than the newcomers who spoke so confidently about change. The fort held less than 3 weeks of grain. The river fish had grown scarce, overfished by too many desperate hands. The Powhatan, who had traded corn and meat throughout the summer, now watched from the forest with hostile eyes. Chief Powhatan had withdrawn his people after repeated incidents of theft and violence by the new colonists. Percy approached Smith as the captain inspected the armory. The older man limped heavily, his face tight with pain he refused to acknowledge. "The weapons are disappearing," Smith said without looking up. "Someone is stealing muskets and powder." Percy nodded. He had noticed the same thing. For trade, most likely. The men are desperate enough to arm the natives in exchange for food. Smith's jaw tightened. Fools. They are trading away our only advantage for a few more days of survival. What will you do? Smith finally looked at him, and Percy saw something unexpected in those hard eyes. Resignation. What can I do, George? I can barely walk. The council wants me gone. Archer has convinced them that democracy will solve our problems, and you believe otherwise. Smith gestured toward the forest beyond the palisade. Out there are thousands of warriors who tolerate us only because we have shown strength. The moment they sense weakness, they will sweep through this fort like a plague. Democracy will not save us. Discipline might have, but that chance is gone. Percy felt cold, despite the heat. Then what happens to us? Smith was silent for a long moment. You will starve, he said finally. You will turn on each other. You will do things that will haunt you forever. And when spring comes, if any of you survive, you will understand why I led the way I did. The council meeting that evening was brief and brutal. Gabriel Archer presented his charter, read aloud the provisions for electing new leadership, and called for a vote. John Martin and John Ratcliffe supported him immediately. The other council members, worn down by the summer's struggles and swayed by Archer's promises, followed. Smith sat silently through it all, his wounded leg propped on a stool, his face expressionless. When the vote concluded, 7-2 against him, he simply nodded. I will not fight this, he said quietly, but I will not stay to watch you destroy what we built. My wound requires treatment I cannot receive here. I will take the next ship to England. Archer smiled, thinking he had won. When will you depart? As soon as a ship is available, Smith replied. A week, perhaps 2. The meeting ended. The council members filed out, some triumphant, others uncertain. Percy lingered, approaching Smith as the captain struggled to stand. You could fight this, Percy said. The soldiers are still loyal to you. Smith shook his head. To what end? I would hold power while dying from this infection. Better to leave them to learn their lessons. Perhaps some will survive to carry the knowledge forward. And if none survive, Smith's expression was bleak. Then England will send more, and more after that, until eventually someone figures out how to make this cursed place work. But not these men. Not this way. Percy helped Smith back to his quarters, the captain's weight heavy against his shoulder. As they walked through the darkening fort, Percy saw men gathered in small groups, their voices excited as they discussed the new order, the freedom from Smith's tyranny, the bright future ahead. They were children celebrating the absence of a strict parent, not understanding that the rules had protected them from dangers they could not imagine. Smith reached his door and paused. George, he said, his voice low, when the hunger comes, and it will come, do not let yourself become what they will become. Hold on to whatever humanity you can. That is all I can tell you. Percy wanted to ask what he meant, but Smith had already disappeared inside, the door closing with a finality that felt like prophecy. October arrived with cold winds that stripped the trees of their remaining leaves. John Smith's wound festered despite the surgeon's efforts, the flesh around the burn site turning colors that promised gangrene if left untreated. He spent his days preparing for departure, organizing what records he could, writing instructions that he knew would be ignored. Gabriel Archer assumed leadership with enthusiasm that bordered on delusion. His first act as president was to abolish Smith's work requirement. Every man would receive equal rations regardless of labor, he declared. This was civilization, not slavery. The fields went untended almost immediately. Why break your back planting winter wheat when you received the same food as those who rested? The logic was irresistible to men already exhausted by months of brutal labor under Smith's regime. The storehouse continued to empty. Archer assured everyone that the Virginia Company would send supplies before winter. Ships were surely on their way, loaded with food and tools and reinforcements. They just needed to wait. Smith watched this unfold with grim satisfaction. He had warned them. Now they would learn. The Powhatan grew bolder. Warriors appeared at the forest edge daily, watching the fort. They no longer came to trade, but to observe, waiting. Thomas Savage, a young Englishman who had lived among them and learned their language, brought troubling news. "Chief Powhatan knows you are leaving," Savage told Smith. "He knows Archer leads now. He says the English will starve themselves without needing Powhatan arrows." Smith nodded slowly. "He is not wrong. Tell me, does Pocahontas speak of this?" Savage's expression darkened. "She does not speak of the English anymore, Captain. Her father forbids it. Whatever friendship existed has ended." Smith felt an unexpected pang at this news. The chief's daughter had been instrumental in maintaining peace, her curiosity about the English tempering her father's hostility. Without her intercession, the fragile relationship had no foundation. On October 9th, 1609, a small ship arrived from England. It brought letters but little food, and most importantly, it offered passage back to London. Smith's salvation had arrived. He boarded the following morning. George Percy came to see him off, along with a handful of soldiers who had served under Smith's command. They stood at the dock, their faces reflecting uncertainty about the future. "Survive the winter," Smith told them. "Do whatever you must, but survive. When spring comes and relief arrives, rebuild. Learn from this, make something better." Percy gripped his hand. "Will you return?" Smith looked back at the fort, at the ramshackle structures and desperate faces. "No," he said quietly. "Jamestown and I are finished, but England is not finished with Virginia. Others will come. Perhaps they will succeed where we failed." The ship pulled away from shore. Smith stood at the rail, watching the settlement recede into the distance. He felt relief at leaving, guilt at abandoning the men who had followed him, and grim certainty about what would unfold in his absence. The fort grew smaller against the vast wilderness. Smoke rose from cooking fires that would soon have nothing to burn. Men moved about their tasks, unaware that they were already ghosts, already dead, just waiting for winter to make it official. Smith turned away, unable to watch any more. His wound throbbed with the ship's motion, but the pain was almost welcome. It reminded him that he was alive, that he had escaped, that whatever horrors awaited Jamestown would unfold without him. He was a survivor. He had always been a survivor, from Turkish slavery to Powhatan captivity to political betrayal. He endured. But as the Virginia coast disappeared beyond the horizon, John Smith understood something that would haunt his remaining years. Survival was not the same as honor. Escaping was not the same as winning, and leaving men to die even when you could not save them still felt like betrayal. The ship sailed east toward England and safety. Behind it, Jamestown entered the darkness that would become legend. The starving time was beginning, and the man who might have prevented it, or at least mitigated its worst horrors, was gone. Winter descended on Jamestown like a sentence. By late November, the temperature had dropped to freezing most nights, and the colonists realized with dawning horror that Gabriel Archer's promises of supply ships had been fantasy. No relief was coming. They were alone with rapidly dwindling provisions and no leadership capable of managing the crisis. George Percy found himself thrust into responsibility he never wanted. Archer's health collapsed within weeks of Smith's departure, a persistent cough turning into full illness that left him bedridden and delirious. John Ratcliffe took control briefly, but proved even more incompetent than feared, hoarding food for himself and his favorites while others starved. The Powhatan attacks began in earnest once the English showed their weakness. Not massive assaults, but calculated strikes. A colonist gathering firewood would disappear. A small hunting party would be ambushed, their bodies left as warnings. The natives moved like shadows through the bare trees, striking without warning and vanishing before retaliation was possible. Percy ordered everyone to remain within the fort. It was meant as protection, but became a death sentence. Now, with no hunting, no foraging, no access to the wider territory, the 500 colonists were trapped in an area that could not sustain them. The grain ran out by early December. The last handful was distributed on the 5th, each person receiving barely enough to fill their palm. After that, there was nothing. No corn, no meat, no fish, nothing. Men began eating anything they could find. Rats and mice were caught and devoured immediately. Snakes that hibernated in the buildings were pulled from cracks and roasted over fires. Leather belts and shoes were boiled into a tasteless paste that provided no nutrition but filled empty stomachs temporarily. The death started slowly, then accelerated. The weak went first. The sick, the elderly, the children who had arrived with the third supply. They simply faded, growing thinner and weaker until one morning they did not wake. There was no ceremony. Bodies were dragged to shallow pits beyond the fort and buried quickly, the work done by men who barely had strength to lift a shovel. By Christmas, 60 colonists had died. Another 100 were so weak they could not leave their beds. The fort had gone silent. The usual sounds of work and conversation replaced by coughing, moaning, and the occasional cry of someone in their final moments. Gabriel Archer died on December 10th, his body consumed by fever and starvation. His last words were incoherent, but Percy thought he heard Smith's name spoken with something that might have been regret. John Ratcliffe died 3 weeks later, killed not by starvation, but by his own stupidity. He led a desperate expedition outside the fort to trade with the Powhatan, offering weapons and tools for food. The natives took the weapons, tortured Ratcliffe to death, and sent his mutilated body back to the fort as a message. Percy, now the undisputed leader of the dying colony, made a decision he knew he would never forgive himself for making. He stopped recording deaths, stopped trying to maintain order, stopped pretending there was any hope of organized survival. Each person was now responsible for themselves. Do whatever necessary to live until spring. Ask no questions, make no judgments. It was permission for the unspeakable, and the colonists took it. The first incident Percy discovered was in mid-January. He found several men gathered around a fire, cooking something that smelled wrong. Too sweet, too familiar. He saw the partially butchered body in the corner and understood immediately what was happening. He should have stopped them, should have maintained some standard of civilization, but he was starving too, and the moral certainty that once would have condemned such acts had been eaten away, along with everything else. Percy turned and walked away without saying a word. If questioned later, he could claim ignorance. He had not seen anything, had not known, had not participated. The lie was paper-thin, but it was all he had left. Spring arrived in April 1610 with warmth that felt like mockery. Of the nearly 500 colonists who had crowded Jamestown in October, fewer than 60 remained alive. The rest lay in shallow graves or had simply disappeared, their fate unrecorded and unremembered. The fort was a ruin. Structures had been torn apart for firewood, leaving only skeletal frames. The palisade walls still stood, but enclosed mostly empty space. The survivors moved like ghosts through the wreckage, too weak to work, too traumatized to speak of what they had endured. George Percy had survived, though he wished sometimes that he had not. His journal contained fragments of the winter, dates, death counts, clinical observations, but he could not bring himself to write the full truth. Some things were too terrible to document, some memories too horrific to preserve. On May 23rd, salvation arrived in the form of Lord de la Warre's relief expedition. 3 ships sailed up the James River, their arrival so unexpected that the surviving colonists thought they were hallucinating. When armed, healthy men came ashore and entered the fort. Many survivors simply collapsed, their desperate endurance finally ending. De la Warre walked through Jamestown with a handkerchief pressed to his face, his expression shifting from shock to horror as he surveyed the devastation. He found Percy in what remained of the headquarters, a hollow-eyed skeleton who somehow still functioned. "How many?" De la Warre asked, though he almost feared the answer. "Of 490, Percy whispered. 60 remain. The number hung in the air like an accusation. De la Warr had brought supplies, medicine, fresh colonists, everything needed to rebuild, but he had arrived months too late for most. What happened here? De la Warr demanded. How did this occur? Percy wanted to explain. Wanted to describe the political collapse after Smith's departure, the incompetence of Archer and Ratcliffe, the Powhatan blockade, the terrible choices made in desperation. But the words would not come. How could he convey the reality of that winter to someone who had not lived it? We starved, Percy said finally. The simple truth seemed inadequate, but was all he could manage. De la Warr organized the relief effort with military efficiency. The survivors were fed carefully. Too much food too quickly could kill them. The fort was cleaned and rebuilt. Fresh colonists were assigned quarters. Plans were made for planting crops and re-establishing trade with the natives. But as De la Warr worked, he kept uncovering evidence of what had really occurred. The mass graves, the butchered remains that were too small to be animals, the hollow-eyed stares of survivors who would not speak of certain things. He compiled a report for the Virginia Company, a sanitized version that acknowledged terrible losses but avoided the worst details. Cannibalism was whispered but never confirmed in writing. The complete breakdown of civilization was described as hardship. The transformation of English colonists into something barely human was called suffering. The truth was too damaging to share publicly. England needed colonists to continue the Virginia venture, and honest accounts of conditions would make recruitment impossible. So the horror was buried beneath euphemism and omission, preserved only in private letters and personal journals that would not surface for centuries. George Percy was evacuated to England in June. He had lost half his body weight, developed permanent health problems from malnutrition, and carried psychological scars that would never heal. He wrote a detailed account of the starving time years later, documenting what he had witnessed, but he never published it, unable to share such horror with a public that preferred heroic narratives to terrible truth. In London, John Smith heard about Jamestown's near collapse. The sanitized reports reached him, along with rumors that contained more accurate details. He read them in his rooms, his healed leg aching as it always did in cold weather, and felt a complex mixture of vindication and guilt. He had been right about what would happen after his departure. The colony had collapsed exactly as he predicted. But being right brought no satisfaction, only the bitter knowledge that 430 people had died to prove his point. Smith never returned to Virginia. He explored and mapped New England instead, writing extensively about colonization, but always avoiding detailed discussion of his final days in Jamestown. That chapter was closed, the wound too deep to examine publicly. He died in 1631 in London, his adventures transformed into legend, but his greatest failure unacknowledged. History would remember him as a founder, a leader, a man who saved Jamestown through discipline and determination. History would forget that he had left Jamestown to die, that his departure had triggered the worst disaster in early American colonial history, that survival had meant abandoning those who depended on him. The starving time became a footnote in American history, a brief mention of hardship overcome through perseverance. The cannibalism became legend, never quite confirmed but never quite denied. The truth of complete civilizational collapse, of humanity stripped away by desperation, of English colonists transformed into creatures that would have been unrecognizable to their former selves, remained buried. Jamestown survived. The colony rebuilt, grew, eventually prospered. Tobacco cultivation made Virginia profitable. More colonists arrived, bringing families and stability. The experiment that had nearly ended in 1610 became the foundation of English presence in North America. But the ghosts remained. In the ground beneath the rebuilt fort, in the memories of survivors who carried their secrets to graves, in the gap between the heroic narrative and the terrible reality. John Smith's final days in Jamestown were not about his departure, but about what his absence revealed. That leadership mattered, that discipline, however harsh, was necessary for survival, that colonies built on fantasies rather than facts would collapse under the weight of reality. 430 people died learning those lessons, and the man who could have taught them chose to save himself instead. That is the truth history tried to forget, the horror buried beneath progress, the cost of empire measured in corpses and cannibalism, and the complete abandonment of everything civilization claimed to represent. Jamestown stands now as a monument to American beginnings. Visitors walk the grounds, read the plaques, imagine the hardships of early colonists, but they cannot truly understand, cannot truly know what happened during those dark months when winter and hunger stripped away every pretense of humanity. The dead remember, the earth remembers, and somewhere in the silence between history and legend, John Smith's ghosts wait, not for forgiveness, that is beyond possibility, but for acknowledgement that they existed, that they suffered, that their deaths mattered for more than just a cautionary tale. This was the horrific reality of John Smith's final days in Jamestown. Not a hero's departure, but a calculated escape. Not a tragedy, but a preventable disaster. Not history as we prefer to remember it, but truth as it actually occurred. Brutal, honest, unforgivable, and absolutely real.